The bank officer didn't invite me to sit. He stood instead, closed the glass door behind me, and slid the blinds down halfway like he didn't want the rest of the floor to see what was about to happen. His hands weren't shaking hard, but enough that I noticed. People miss details like that when they're emotional. I wasn't. He cleared his throat, lowered his voice, and said a single sentence that made my stomach go cold in a very specific way. Miss Harper, according to our records, you legally lost control of your father's estate 12 days before he died. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He just waited, like the damage was already done and my reaction was the last formality. I asked him to repeat it slower. He did, and this time he added one more word that mattered. Irrevocably. The air in that office felt tight, artificial, like recycled oxygen. I nodded once, not because I understood, but because I knew this moment would come someday. I just hadn't expected it to come from a bank instead of a courtroom. As I walked back to my car, the memory of the funeral slid into place without warning, like a file my brain had been holding open. The chapel had smelled like polished wood and flowers that were already starting to die. I stood near the aisle, hands folded, listening to people say my father's name like it belonged to a story they were finished with. Grief has a way of making you invisible unless you perform it correctly. I didn't perform. That was when Nathan Cole laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. He leaned toward his aunt, shook his head, and said, "Man, I still can't believe he never fixed the will. Guess some people don't like paperwork." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. A few people smiled awkwardly, relieved someone had broken the tension. One woman glanced at my shoes, like sorrow should come with better presentation. Nathan wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly, tailored in a way that suggested planning, not respect. When I passed him after the service, he stopped me with a gentle hand on my elbow. "You okay, Claire?" he asked, voice smooth, practiced. "This stuff can get overwhelming. Don't worry, I've got it handled." I remember the exact way he said handled, like it was a favor I hadn't earned and a responsibility he was happy to carry in my place. At the time, I told myself he meant well. That's the lie you tell when you don't want trouble yet. Growing up, my father taught me two things that mattered more than anything else. First, never rush a decision when someone else is pushing you to. Second, always keep copies. He'd say it casually, sliding papers into labeled folders, explaining trusts and liabilities like they were common sense instead of survival tools. After my mother died, it was just the two of us. Quiet dinners. Early mornings. Numbers written neatly on yellow legal pads. He believed clarity was kindness. When he remarried, Nathan was already an adult, charming in a way that made people feel safe fast. He worked in finance, talked about investments like he was doing you a favor by explaining them. When my father's health started slipping, Nathan stepped in naturally. Too naturally. "I'll take him to the appointments," he said. I know the language. Doctors spoke in careful terms about medication, stress, early cognitive decline. Nathan summarized everything for me in hallways and parking lots. "Nothing major," he'd say. "Just paperwork stuff." I noticed how often paperwork came up. New forms. Updated authorizations. Temporary access that somehow became permanent. I didn't fight him. I watched. I listened. I saved emails. I noticed the day my father stopped asking me about the accounts. I noticed the day Nathan started answering questions that weren't directed at him. I noticed the way a nurse hesitated once before handing Nathan a clipboard, then did it anyway. At the time, I wondered if I was imagining patterns that weren't there. If grief was teaching me to be suspicious of everyone. That doubt kept me quiet, and silence gave him room. At the funeral reception, Nathan stood near the front, accepting condolences like a role he'd rehearsed. When someone asked about the estate, he smiled and said, "Everything's already in motion. Claire doesn't need that stress right now." It sounded generous. It wasn't. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and laid everything out by date. Hospital visits. Bank alerts I hadn't paid attention to. A trust amendment filed while my father was listed as having diminished capacity. A power of attorney that didn't include my signature but carried my name anyway. Small things, each one explainable on its own. Together, they told a very clean story. Clean enough to look intentional. Clean enough to scare me. The next morning, I walked into First Federal Trust and asked one neutral question. Can I review the current control structure on my father's accounts? That was when the officer closed the door. Sitting in my car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, I felt something shift. Not rage. Not panic. Alignment. Nathan thought this was over. He thought funerals were endings. He thought silence meant weakness and grief meant confusion. He had no idea how much time I'd been buying by staying quiet, by keeping copies, by letting him feel comfortable. As I started the engine, I heard my father's voice as clearly as if he were in the passenger seat. Don't rush. Keep records. And for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel small. I felt precise. The truth doesn't rush, but it does arrive. And when it does, it brings receipts. The bank office stayed with me longer than it should have. Not the words themselves, but the way they were delivered. The door closing behind me hadn't sounded dramatic. It was soft. Intentional. Like a decision already made somewhere else. I didn't call anyone on the drive back from the bank. I didn't cry. I didn't even replay the sentence again. I let it sit, unfinished, the way unfinished things reveal more when you don't rush them. The house was quiet when I got home. Too quiet for a day that had ended with a funeral and a bank disclosure. Nathan wasn't there yet. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that I didn't check my phone to see where he was. I already knew. He'd be with people. Managing optics. He was good at that. He always had been. The first thing I did was open the small fireproof box my father insisted we keep, the one he used to joke about like it was an old friend. Inside were copies. Not everything, but enough. Statements folded the same way every year. Old trust drafts with handwritten notes in the margins. Power of attorney documents that had been superseded, then quietly revived. At the time, I remembered thinking it was redundant. Now it felt deliberate. My father had believed in preparation, not paranoia. That difference mattered. I sat at the dining table and began laying the papers out by date, not by importance. Patterns don't reveal themselves when you prioritize them. They show up when you give them space. 12 days before he died. That number returned again and again. A trust amendment request. A change in administrative access. Temporary medical authorization forms filed as permanent. Each one clean on its own. Reasonable. Defensible. Together, they created something else. Something directional. I remembered the hospital. How the nurse had glanced at me before handing the clipboard to Nathan. How he'd smiled like it was nothing, like he was just being helpful. I already spoke with them, he'd said. I know the language. I'd let that sentence pass. I told myself it was grief talking when I felt uneasy. That I was being territorial. That I was tired. That was my mistake. Control rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives politely, using your exhaustion as an invitation. The funeral replayed differently once the paperwork was in front of me. The whispers hadn't been random. They'd been confident. Nathan's friends didn't sound unsure. They sounded informed. He never fixed the will. That wasn't speculation. It was rehearsal. I pulled the estate summary my father's attorney had sent months earlier. The numbers were exact. Too exact for someone who was supposedly out of the loop. I remembered how Nathan had started answering questions that weren't directed at him. How he'd corrected me gently in front of others. That's not quite how it works, he'd say, smiling as if clarity was a favor. I used to think that was support. Now I understood it as positioning. That night, Nathan came home late. He kissed my forehead, asked if I'd eaten, told me the service had been handled well. He didn't ask about the bank. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He talked about logistics. About timelines. About how things would settle once the noise died down. I watched him talk the way you watch someone assemble something they didn't realize you were studying. He mentioned the trust casually. It's mostly administrative now, he said. Cleaner this way. Cleaner for whom, I wondered. But I didn't ask. Questions alert people. Silence educates them. Over the next few days, I stopped reacting and started documenting. Every email. Every forwarded message. Every instance where someone spoke for me without checking. I noticed how often Nathan used my father's name when explaining decisions. As if invoking him made everything legitimate. I noticed how often he referred to things already decided. They've approved it. They're expecting this. Passive language. Authority without a face. When I called the hospital to request my father's records, the administrator hesitated. Not because the request was invalid, but because it was unexpected. We already released those, she said. I asked to whom. There was a pause. Then a name. Nathan's. Not forged. Authorized. Temporarily. Extended quietly. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse anyone. I started assembling a timeline that didn't rely on memory. Documents don't forget. People do. Somewhere in the middle of that week, I realized something that should have frightened me, but didn't. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later. What I felt was clarity. The kind that narrows your focus and removes unnecessary emotion. My father hadn't been careless. He'd been sick. And someone had mistaken that for opportunity. The bank officer's words returned, not as a threat now, but as context. Control hadn't been lost suddenly. It had been transferred quietly, using rules designed for trust. That night, I drafted an email I didn't send. I saved it instead, timestamped, unsent. Proof of awareness matters almost as much as proof of action. Nathan slept beside me, breathing evenly, already confident in an outcome he believed was sealed. I stared at the ceiling and felt something settle into place. Not fear. Calculation. The truth was no longer abstract. It was documented. And it was patient. The ember glow outside stretched across the hallway, casting long, deliberate shadows over polished wood floors. The air inside was thick with stillness, almost expectant, as if it knew secrets would soon surface. Control leaves fingerprints if you're patient enough to notice. I saw them everywhere, the tilt of the family portraits, the subtle dust patterns on the mantel, the faint scent of dying flowers from last week's cleaning. Nothing happened by chance. Nathan occupied the armchair he always claimed as his own, the half-smile of arrogance playing lightly on his lips. His posture was casual, but every slight shift betrayed entitlement, a sense of ownership that funeral decorum could never strip away. He flicked through papers, unconsciously organizing, signaling a comfort born from underestimating me. I remained at the doorway, letting the quiet settle between us. Observation first, reaction later. He interpreted my silence as submission, a critical miscalculation. I moved deliberately across the room, each step precise, as if the floor itself could measure intent. I settled at the table, fingers brushing against a stack of files, some open, some closed, all meticulously labeled. Individually harmless. Collectively undeniable. This was the story of control, manipulation, and oversight, each sheet a thread in a web he never realized I was weaving. Nathan glanced up, noting my presence without understanding its significance. "I didn't expect you here so soon," he said, voice casual, testing boundaries. I nodded once, neutral. No betrayal of emotion. No hint of panic. His eyes searched for cues, but there were none. I let him believe I had none. I spread a folder labeled Family Trust, timeline before me, flipping pages with deliberate slowness. Each amendment, signature, and note was accounted for. My attention to detail mirrored the lessons my father had instilled: observe, document, and trust the system to protect truth. I noticed the day Dad stopped asking me about account statements, I murmured, tone even. Nathan's subtle twitch at the corner of his eye betrayed his discomfort, micro-expression gold. The arrogance that had carried him thus far now became his blind spot. A soft knock interrupted the rhythm. I lifted my gaze toward the door. Standing there was an attorney, one I had contacted days prior for preliminary review only. His presence was unobtrusive, understated, observing, noting, not yet acting. He carried a small leather portfolio, light enough to be unassuming, heavy enough to signify seriousness. His entrance hinted at authority without revealing power. "We're only reviewing observations for now," he said, setting the portfolio down. "Nothing final, just ensuring awareness." The phrasing was careful, strategic. Nathan's casual mask faltered for the briefest fraction of a second, a subtle recognition that control was beginning to shift. I sipped water calmly, the weight of the words settling in silence. I revisited the documents, scanning for inconsistencies, recording timestamps, highlighting subtle overlaps in powers of attorney and trust amendments. Silent notes filled my mental ledger. Dates aligned, minor edits traced, minor anomalies clustered logically. Each piece added to the inevitability of exposure. Nathan remained unaware. He continued to believe the narrative belonged to him. Time moved quietly, the sun dipping lower, shadows stretching further into the room. I worked in silence, letting the paperwork speak. Nathan attempted small talk, a veneer of control. "Everything seems in order," he said, eyes flicking toward mine, searching for weakness. I nodded, expression unreadable. Every pause, every hesitation, every microshift of his gaze was observed, catalogued, stored. I recalled each moment from the funeral, the whispers, the smirks, the public amusement over what they thought were harmless mistakes in my father's estate planning. Those microdramas had long since been fuel for strategy, not rage. Methodical, calculated drive, not emotion, would guide the next steps. Minutes stretched into hours, but the passage of time was irrelevant. Momentum was measured not by speed, but by alignment. Subtle signals, small missteps, timing, and silent observation all converged. Micro-twists were forming, the first dominoes poised, legal leverage quietly accumulating, authority systems awaiting the perfect signal. As dusk deepened, I arranged the final files in the sequence I had rehearsed in my mind. Each document, timestamp, and annotation contributed to a narrative that was unstoppable in hindsight. Nathan, confident in his assumed dominance, had no idea that the quiet force he dismissed would soon dictate outcomes. I allowed a small, internal nod of satisfaction. Not triumph. Not victory. Control. Precision. Preparation. I moved to the window, tracing the fading sun across the horizon. In the glass, my reflection mirrored the calm determination I carried. This wasn't revenge. It was preparation. Every calculated step, every observation, every subtle recording aligned to a slow, inevitable collapse. I felt momentum, deliberate and silent, ready to carry me through the next act. The game had started, and I was already several moves ahead. The morning was heavy, not with grief, but with the weight of unspoken truths. I arrived at my father's home before anyone else, the driveway empty, only the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower interrupting the morning silence. Inside, the amber light of early sunlight traced the edges of the polished oak staircase, and the dust motes danced lazily in its beams. Every corner held memories, mundane, ordinary, and yet now strangely threatening. I moved deliberately, my heels whispering against the wooden floors, my eyes scanning, measuring, cataloging. The folders I had prepared were tucked under my arm, each labeled meticulously. Accounts, trusts, emails, and letters, all evidential threads I had patiently woven for months. The front door opened abruptly behind me, the subtle click of it breaking my rhythm. Nathan, in his usual armchair, half-smile playing on his lips, glanced up. His eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by entitlement. "You're early," he said casually, though the tilt of his head and the slight twitch near his eye suggested he felt uncomfortably observed. I didn't answer. Observation first, reaction later. The silence filled the space like a living entity, each second calibrated. I laid the first folder on the table, letting the crisp sound of the paper echo, a quiet but deliberate declaration of presence. Each document was a miniature revelation. Small numbers, dates, signatures, every seemingly innocuous detail now a thread in a growing web of undeniable proof. The trust amendment executed days before my father's passing, the email exchanges that documented Nathan's knowledge yet silent compliance, the power of attorney forms that had slipped under everyone's attention, all stacked meticulously. I moved them like chess pieces, every shift calculated, every alignment precise. Individually, each file appeared harmless. Collectively, they formed an indisputable map of financial manipulation, control, and neglect. I glanced toward the doorway. There stood the attorney I had contacted in the prior weeks, observing silently, leather portfolio in hand. He was a quiet authority, not intrusive, merely witnessing, processing, and validating the narrative I had prepared. His presence alone shifted the weight of the room, transforming it from private confrontation to a professional audit, a stage set for inevitable exposure. No promises, no exaggerated gestures, just the professional tension that only years of legal acumen could project. He nodded subtly, acknowledging the meticulous work spread before him. Nathan shifted, unaware, or perhaps pretending to be, that every micro-expression I noted became ammunition. The half-smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he noticed the way files had been organized, the timestamps visible, the small sticky notes coded and precise. He leaned back, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, yet each movement betrayed the slightest unease. Observation continued. I noted the micro-twitch of his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, each a psychological marker, silently catalogued for later leverage. The morning progressed, hours stretching without urgency yet heavy with implication. I methodically reviewed each account, line by line, letting the paperwork speak louder than any argument ever could. Each pause, each hesitation from Nathan, and each acknowledgement from the attorney layered tension and control. We worked silently, letting facts and documents carry the weight of the confrontation. There was no need for theatrics. The truth alone demanded attention. Nathan's confidence, meticulously built over years, began to show cracks, subtle at first, but undeniably present. A soft ping from the attorney's laptop drew my attention. The final email thread I had prepared, addressed to multiple stakeholders but held in draft, was now visible on the screen. It highlighted undisclosed debts, discrepancies in account management, and silent waiver forms Nathan had unwittingly authorized. Each revelation, calculated and deliberate, was a domino waiting for the correct push. I didn't speak. I merely let the facts breathe, each one a quiet, controlled message. The system was aware, and there was no room for evasion. As the afternoon sun crept higher, shadows lengthened, drawing contrast between the calm in me and the simmering anxiety in Nathan. The attorney finally spoke, his voice low but firm, threading authority into the room. If these documents are accurate, and they appear to be, the exposure is comprehensive. Any attempt to contest now will only magnify accountability. His words were neither threatening nor consoling. They were a statement of procedural inevitability, and the room acknowledged it. I sat back slightly, eyes narrowing as I observed Nathan's reaction. He spoke, but his words faltered mid-sentence, an unusual pause betraying his discomfort. The micro-twists I had layered over months, financial traps, silent preparations, legally binding documents, were now converging into a slow, undeniable collapse. There was no dramatic shouting, no emotional eruption, just a quiet shift in the balance of power. He realized, finally, that years of control and manipulation could be undone not by confrontation, but by calculated, patient preparation. The shadows stretched across the polished floorboards as the attorney left, offering one last confirming nod. Nathan remained, an image of authority stripped of its facade, confronted by the silent but unyielding evidence I had assembled. I gathered my files, each one a testament to preparation, to patience, and to controlled intelligence. The room retained its calm, almost mundane appearance, but beneath the surface, a quiet revolution had occurred. The final micro-twist arrived in the form of a subtle email timestamp, proof that this sequence of events was documented, unalterable, and ready for public revelation if needed. I glanced once more at Nathan, now pale, the room's sunlight catching the corners of his eyes in an almost cinematic clarity. I did not gloat. There was no need. Strategic preparation was its own satisfaction. I left the house with the quiet confidence that comes from having done everything correctly. No one outside understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The collapse of control, the exposure of manipulation, and the anticipation of legal consequences had all been orchestrated silently, methodically, perfectly. And as the door closed behind me, the weight lifted, not just of the confrontation, but of years spent anticipating this moment. I was ready for what came next, and the calm certainty in my steps was a signal I didn't need to voice. The game had begun, and I held all the pieces. The morning was unhurried, deceptively calm, a fragile stillness that felt like the final breath before a storm, though the storm had already passed. I walked into my father's old study, the polished mahogany desk gleaming faintly in the amber light that filtered through half-drawn blinds. Everything was exactly where it should be, deceptively ordinary. The folders I had left during my meticulous Part 4 preparation were still aligned, edges perfect, each label facing the observer, as if inviting scrutiny. Nathan entered behind me, hesitant, his usual armchair dominance gone, replaced by a subtle unease. He glanced at the files, at the attorney who now sat quietly reviewing them, and then back at me. He tried a smile, the half-smile of entitlement, but it faltered, hesitation betraying him. I didn't speak. Observation first, reaction later. He had spent years believing silence meant submission. Today, silence meant strategy, control, and inevitable exposure. I approached the desk slowly, each step deliberate. The attorney's presence was calm, almost invisible, but every movement he made reinforced the gravity of the moment. "If these documents are accurate, which they appear to be," he said, voice even, "the consequences for any attempt at contestation will be irreversible." Not threatening, not vengeful, pure authority, procedural inevitability. I placed a small envelope in front of Nathan. Inside were the final confirmations, the notarized amendments, timestamps of communications, audit trails, and the subtle but undeniable proof of his mismanagement and silent collusion. He opened it, his eyes scanning rapidly. The color drained from his face in real time, though he tried to maintain composure. Each micro-expression was a crack in the facade, a twitch at the corner of his eye, a slight narrowing, the subtle tremor of a jaw. I recalled all the careful preparation, the emails I had drafted but held in reserve, the minor discrepancies I had left as bait, the silent yet undeniable proof of trust amendments executed without his awareness. Individually, each was small, plausible, deniable. Together, they formed a narrative so tightly bound, so professionally undeniable, that it required no dramatics to communicate the inevitable collapse. Nathan finally spoke, words forced, measured, an attempt at charm. "You think this will ruin me?" His voice had a tremor, almost imperceptible, but the attorney caught it immediately. I let him speak, letting his arrogance provide context for the final reveal. Each word was catalogued, each hesitation noted. The attorney cleared his throat and quietly summarized the evidence. The slow unraveling began, hidden debts exposed, waiver forms highlighted, beneficiary shifts clarified. I didn't intervene. The system itself was speaking, and Nathan realized, piece by piece, that he had overplayed his control. The collapse wasn't loud, it was inevitable, quiet, and comprehensive. Hours passed without any need for shouting or melodrama. The final email, now sent to multiple stakeholders with proof attached, landed like a quiet bomb. Financial manipulations, legal oversights, and silent betrayals were all documented and shared. Nathan could only watch, powerless, as every advantage he had relied upon crumbled under the weight of professional, patient, methodical preparation. As the sun moved west, I finally spoke, calm and measured. "It's not about revenge. It's about fairness and clarity. I've waited. The system doesn't need me to shout. It needs me to act." The room absorbed the statement not as a threat but as a conclusion. He realized, too late, that all his manipulation, charm, and control could not withstand methodical truth. The attorney offered one last nod, an acknowledgement of professional closure, then left silently. Nathan sat alone, confronted not by anger or shouting, but by the undeniable sequence of facts, documents, and evidence he had ignored or underestimated. The room seemed to breathe with a quiet victory, one that did not require theatrics, one that restored dignity rather than inflaming emotion. I gathered my files, every document a testament to patience and intelligence. I did not gloat, I did not gesture. I merely walked away, leaving Nathan with the consequences of his own choices, the professional and legal weight now fully resting on his shoulders. Outside, the air was crisp, sunlight warm on my face, a contrast to the storm of documentation and silent justice inside. I paused at the threshold, reflecting on the journey, every subtle red flag, every micro-twist, every calculated preparation had led here. This was the payoff, not instant wealth, not dramatized revenge, but peace, autonomy, and restored control over my life. My father's lessons had guided me, and patience, observation, and intelligence had executed them perfectly. Walking into the quiet streets, the calm clarity in my steps mirrored the unshakable truth. I was free. Free from manipulation, free from unseen control, free from the burden of unchecked arrogance. The world outside did not know it, and yet the shift was complete. Nathan's era of dominance had ended, not with shouting, but with quiet, undeniable authority executed with precision. Finally, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Not for triumph, but for closure. The files, the proof, the slow collapse, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one I had completed with skill, patience, and unwavering calm. "I'm not rich. I'm free," I whispered, knowing that the real victory had never been about money, status, or spectacle. It had been about reclaiming control, ensuring justice, and protecting the future. And in that quiet confidence, with the documents secured and the system itself aligned in my favor, I finally exhaled. The storm had passed, and I had emerged not just unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and unstoppable.